What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to have a very special full-length interview. But if you're new to the podcast, we have different shows kind of within the show where we have rants where I just kind of go on and vent or discuss some hot topics and, maybe call out some people in the industry. Totally outside of that, we also have mental minutes, those quick mental game hacks that help elevate your performance, whether it's in the zone mentally, physically, or maybe even down just little rabbit holes to help you as a player or a coach get into that zone that you're looking for. And then also deep dive educational explorations, which I'm sure we'll get a little bit into today. Just a small little wow, can't talk today. Intricacies like skill acquisition or how to be in the zone or specific things of being in the zone, whether that's strength training or today we're going to go into a little bit more biomechanics. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and bring on Steve Leicht. Did I say that right?
Leached. It's all right though.
Ah, see, I knew that was going to happen. But hey, now everybody knows Leached is where it's at. Not to be confused with the NASCAR racer. It's spelled different. You got a V, he's a PH, Steven, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I love it. I was just, yeah, we were talking about this before we were recording. I was like, hey, I had no idea you were also very similar to a NASCAR guy. So NASCAR is big here in Charlotte. We got all the, NASCAR Hall of Fame and all that stuff. But welcome on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, we initially kind of connected via Instagram, and you were just kind of talking a little bit about your role with the White Sox as more of a biomechanist. So, kind of talk to us a little bit about how you got there, and then maybe kind of back up a little bit more through your kind of whole entire baseball journey, catch you up to where you are now.
Yeah, so currently I'm with the White Sox as a sports scientist and biomechanist. But I actually grew up in the Boston area and played baseball pretty much my entire life. Pretty much just I always wanted to play a sport in college and kind of did everything I can to get there. But obviously, growing up in the Northeast, there's not a lot of opportunities to develop or kind of get the most out of everything. So definitely struggled a bit to get recruited. Ended up playing Division III ball at the College of Worcester, which is just about an hour south of Cleveland, Ohio. But basically, when I was there, beginning of freshman year, I met Alec Hammond, who's the founder of Connected Performance, and basically was just one of his first clients. And worked with him and Ben Baggett and just kind of really dove into player development and kind of just helping my own performance and seeing if I could increase velocity, increase command, and so forth. And basically just kind of fell in love with all of that. But throughout the years, I kind of dealt with injuries and issues with performance and all that. So I basically kind of realized once I hung my cleats up, I kind of wanted to help others with their own development. And that kind of led to getting an internship with Tread Athletics last summer. It was an amazing opportunity to work with those guys and kind of see what it's like to work with the best of the best. But an amazing opportunity, but I kind of always wanted to work in professional sports. And the way to do that, I guess, in my industry is basically to go to graduate school, get your master's or get your PhD, whether it's in sports science or kinesiology, biomechanics, so forth. But while I was there, got offered the role I have right now at the White Sox and kind of just fast forwarded through that progress. And yeah, here I am just working with athletes out in Arizona. So I kind of see a wide range of players from rookie ball all the way to 15-year MLB vets. So it's kind of nice to see the wide range of players you work with. Some are 17, 18 years old, and some are in their late 30s. But yeah, that's pretty much a quick recap of my playing career and where I'm at now.
No, I love it, man. That's awesome. Appreciate you kind of catching us all up with that. And it's really cool. I'm sure for me, it made a huge difference in my coaching career being around a lot of professional guys and then seeing like, oh, hey, like a high school guy versus a pro guy, there's a major difference in how they go about doing things and how just so much more attention to detail and present they are with every single rep. Um, it's kind of there are professionals, so they take it very seriously because they are getting paid for it. It's kind of their livelihood.
Mhm.
Um, but how has your experience been just kind of being around that, seeing that? Obviously, you said like rookie ball, so there's a huge range almost where it's like high level high school to maybe you have some rehab guys or maybe even other dudes early in spring training. You're probably seeing everybody from all different walks coming in from there too. So, um, how was that experience based off of maybe like what you saw at Tread or maybe just working with Alec and Ben, who huge fans of, by the way?
Yeah, I think in terms of just understanding how pro ball works, there's kind of a lot that goes into it, and like there's departments that you haven't even really heard of that are things that people you're working with on a consistent basis. And then just kind of seeing like the guys who are the highly valued players versus the low value players, and kind of just seeing how um they go about their business, and it seems pretty similar no matter where you come from. They're kind of all just willing to do whatever it takes to be the best they can be. And obviously, kind of just depends on the individual and where they come from. But I think the main things I kind of took away from this experience was just understanding more of what sports science really is, because it's kind of a misunderstood topic. Basically, it's and when I originally thought of it, I kind of thought more it was like biomechanics and understanding how the body moves, or coming up with the best ways to develop players. But I mean, it's huge, obviously, and stuff in terms of the weight room as well, and kind of doing certain specific tests such as like counter movement jumps or isometric mid thigh pulls and stuff like that, basically just to understand how players produce force and power, not just when they swing or throw a ball, but and stuff in the weight room too. And you can kind of see how they correlate and all that. And then you can also see stuff in terms of like the rehab side of things, basically understanding stuff such as workload or return to play protocols, and basically just seeing how it can kind of all work together. And I thought it was really interesting how we basically can collaborate with not just people within my own department, but people like coaches and physical therapists, and obviously the players themselves too. And it's nice to see that we can kind of bring everything together, kind of use that holistic approach to, I guess, come up with the best solution to help, I guess, make each individual the best version of themselves. But yeah, I thought it was great. And I think Tread did a great job of that too. I think Alec and Ben do a great job with that. I think you guys do a great job with that. But it's cool to kind of see it in action, not just working with one individual or a small group of individuals, but working with multiple teams too, and kind of just hopefully few years down the line, seeing how these guys can develop and progress into hopefully the game's best players.
Oh, absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head where pro ball is a lot more in depth, having a lot of different like departments where you have like nutritionists and maybe it's not just the biomechanics or the pitching coach side. You have the sports science guy, you have the PTs and ATs and all those that kind of have to work together and talk to each other and make sure that they're all on the same page, all in pulling in the same direction, right? And at that high of a level, right? Like everybody can have kind of a generalized idea of how all of those work, but where you get to a higher level of professional sports, you may have those small little things that like someone who is fully ingrained into that, right? So like for a physical therapist, for example, right? Like they got to know a whole lot of other stuff, even though maybe a strength coach or a pitching coach might know some of the general stuff. They have to know how to maybe have those small little like, 1%, 1% of things that you may not normally see in normal day to day, PT or baseball, where they're like, hey, this is an anomaly, and we kind of have to go off the rails or kind of problem solve off of that, right? And I'm sure there was a lot of that you saw this year in pro ball. It's like, hey, like we got to figure this out to help get this guy ready to be able to get back on the field and play again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially since they're all pretty much elite athletes, but they are also kind of outliers in certain ways. They don't really fit the same mold. So it's interesting to see how like people in my department, other departments can kind of come up with ways to figure out the best way for. I mean, there's PTs I work with or strength conditioning coaches that I work with that don't come from a baseball background, and I think that's totally fine in a lot of cases, because you can kind of give that outside perspective, and seeing how they can deal with other sports or kind of their own playing histories, and see how you can kind of translate to baseball too, which I think sometimes people both in the professional side of things and the private side of things can kind of get a little lost in it, because you can see a lot of, I guess translations or similarities across different sports or I guess different departments and different philosophies. But yeah, no, it's really cool.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny that you said that because, you were talking about like how the private sector can get lost in certain things, and we were all guilty of it, right? Like we want to chase velo or we're looking for a certain metric and like kind of making that the main thing, but obviously the main thing is performance on the field, right?
Mhm.
Looking back, being at this, high level professional with the White Sox, seeing how all of these guys and what they actually have as KPIs or like they hold high as parts of what they're looking at. And then kind of looking back to maybe either your own playing career or maybe, some other places that you're at in the private sector like Tread, like what were some of those things that maybe have had some misconceptions or maybe they were just putting a little bit too much weight on compared to what you're seeing now?
Yeah, I think this can you can kind of look at it in multiple ways, but I think sometimes I'm a huge fan of this. Basically, I think the throw can kind of dictate everything else or the swing. Basically, you can see a lot of inefficiencies or also some things that people do well just by looking at their throw, and it can kind of translate to things in the weight room and and I guess other sectors as well. Um, but I think sometimes people, like I guess for an example, like let's say you look at somebody's delivery and they have um, an issue with their back leg, and basically like they just don't have like let's say like pelvic ER and IR stuff like that. And let's say they're dominant in pelvic IR, especially in their femur. So basically, they're going to look like a certain position on the mound, and then basically you kind of translate that into the weight room. They're probably not going to be great at squatting with their knees out. It's kind of a classic example. Um, and I think it's a good thing for strength conditioning coaches to realize that and be like, hey, this is like you got to stick to this cookie cutter approach or the kind of one size fits all approach, which obviously isn't the case sometimes. But I think sometimes people can kind of get lost or kind of too stuck in that when you're working with an athlete, especially they have limitations in terms of just general force or power outputs. I think just the idea of building that foundation or kind of building that strength and kind of going from there and then seeing how your body can kind of adapt over time, which is something I didn't really think about, or I don't think others thought about too. I think as you get stronger and as you get more mature, I think it's obviously very noticeable, especially in high school or early collegiate athletes, is that your body's going to change. And basically, you kind of have to understand how the way you move is going to change as your body changes. And I think it's great to see how it's great to look at the throw. It's great to look at the swing. I mean, I can talk about that stuff for days. But I think it's understanding that just because you have this one limitation or issue now doesn't mean it's going to be the same thing in 6 months from now or a year from now, or maybe even a few weeks from now. So I think it kind of just people can kind of get like paralysis by analysis. I think they get really caught up in one thing at one time, and I dealt with this all the time as a player. But just kind of having more trust in the process or whoever you're working with, and kind of understanding that, hey, just because I'm at this point now, let's say you only throw 80 something miles an hour and you want to throw 90 something miles an hour, well, you're probably not one small cue away. I think it's probably a series or a hopefully linear progression throughout months and years to get to that point where you can obviously become the best version of yourself, the best athlete that you want to be. So I think a lot of people just kind of get stuck in that one time frame and just hopefully they can take a step back and understand that it is a process. You just kind of got to take it a day at a time and hope for the best.
No, absolutely. Well, I think it does kind of bleed into that microwave mentality, right? Where everybody's like, oh, hey, what's that one quick fix? Or they see these reels on TikTok and they're like, oh, hey, yeah, let me do this or let me do this. And this is going to what's fix everything and help, get all of the velocity I'm missing or whatever velo leak that I have. This is unlock, right? Quote unquote. You hear that all the time.
Hmm.
That was really big. But uh, it's so much more than that, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think people are starting to understand that. They're like, all right, hey, maybe early on, whenever you're a high schooler, I talk to some guys who are just kind of getting into the difference between just playing and training and playing, right? They're like, oh, okay, like this isn't just like a 1 month thing. This is 3 months, 6 months progression, 12 months progression, and then even more on top of that, like, hey, you're you're training for your career, training also for your life, and helping you become a better mover to be able to kind of like what I referred to other was like, hey, learn how to problem solve, learn how to get dudes out, right?
Mhm.
It's two totally different things, but to your point too, you don't want to get caught up in the training mindset of only having that one metric that you're trying to chase or that one thing that you're going for there. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just, I mean, people obviously focus so much on velocity, and obviously velocity is going to get your foot in the door. But yeah, once you kind of get there and you see it at the pro level too, you kind of have to get outs and compete and have nasty off speed and kind of just go from there and be able to command the ball well too. And it's kind of just, it's not one thing, it's everything.
that's it. No, I love it. And kind of going a little bit off what you said before, it's I always think of the old adage of like, hey, one man never sets or stands in the same river twice, right? The river's always moving, and he's always never the same man. I'm sure I probably butchered that. That's kind of like my very summarized version of it. But seeing your title of your thesis back in school, sociocultural and biomechanical impacts, I was like, wow, like that's really in depth. If you like really go like doctorate level breaking things down, or ecological. Sure, you may have heard of that ecological approach. Tanner Pruitt was who's been on the podcast several times is a lot um, really into that because it isn't never just one thing, right? There's multiple other things. It could be, hey, I had a stressful day at school or in class, or my girlfriend broke up with me, right? Like there's always these little things that could be coming up. But yeah, I want you to kind of take the floor here and talk a little bit about that thesis, what you kind of broke down, and what you also kind of learned from that as well.
Yeah, so I completed this about around the time of the World Baseball Classic last year. So I basically looked at three geographic regions. There's North America, or I guess more of the United States, and then I looked at Latin America and East Asia, countries like Japan and South Korea, because obviously those are the
Those are the
um,
projects. Yeah.
that's where everybody in the majors is pretty much from. And you can also see like the games becoming more global. And I mean, Latin American players represent, I think, a third, if not more, of Major League Baseball now, and it's just rising and rising every year. And then obviously you'll see guys like Otani and then Yamamoto and Imanaga, and then you'll see guys like Roki Sasaki in a few years just
Mhm.
come on in. So like the game there is obviously growing too and having a huge impact in the majors. So I think it's like, oh, like when you kind of look at these guys move and how they perform, it's obviously a lot different than you see for the Americans. And basically, I kind of wanted to look at three separate things and see how they can kind of relate. So the first thing I wanted to look at is see how these regions differ in terms of how they move or their biomechanics. Um, and then basically you can see here that and you can tie it into basically their anatomical structure, their anatomy, and seeing if there's anything different or any commonalities that you see between these regions. And then you kind of look at things such as socioculture, which is kind of more focused on, I guess, their training programs or their training backgrounds. And you can even look at stuff too, like resources in their economy. And the I guess the takeaways I kind of had from this is that obviously, if you're from the US, basically you're going to have more of an emphasis on the weight room and kind of getting stronger, and they're going to be more likely to be bigger in terms of body composition compared to players from other parts of the world, but they're not necessarily going to move as well. So they kind of quote unquote like muscle their way into high velocity. When if you look at somebody from Latin America, their culture is kind of just like pick it up and throw it as hard as you can. And basically through that method, they kind of throughout these years have trained their body to move in certain ways efficiently, and they can get into these incredible ranges of motion with their upper half, especially with their upper spine, their cervical spine, their thoracic spine, that you don't really see anywhere else in the world, even if they are smaller than the Americans. But I think the one thing that, or I guess the region that I guess biased, I personally enjoy the most is looking at Japanese and Korean pitchers because they practice. I'm blanking on the name. I think it's Shizu. I probably am wrong, but it's the practice of military posture in these countries such as Japan and South Korea. So basically, they have this completely perfect posture, almost perfect, and it's allowed them to get into these incredible positions, not only with their spine, but their lower half and their pelvis as well. So you see guys from here, even though they're incredibly undersized, they have unbelievable hip internal and external rotation. And they also have incredible spinal mobility with flexion and extension. And you can look at stuff too, with lateral flexion as well and extension. But basically, it's like separating them into seeing why they throw as hard as they do, and then understanding all of this and understanding their training background and what works for them is the best approach for their development, especially as you see the game continue to globalize and more international players come here too. So I think it's a great kind of understanding of when you're working with somebody, not just from the US, but also other parts of the world too. And I also think you can apply it to people in the US, especially if they're from, let's say, a person's from the South and a person's from the Northeast. They're probably training much differently because in the South or out West, they're outside all year long, playing all year long. In the Northeast, you're just trapped in a facility for 8, 9 months of the year. So I think it's a great kind of just understanding of how to look at everything again holistically and then individualizing it for the player. But yeah, I guess I can talk about this for days too. I'm just
Oh,
kind
I
of
love it.
rambling
This
on
is
at this
awesome.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you kind of break it down, and you're spot on. Like there's just, in generalities, right? Like there's always some little anomalies and things here, but
Hmm.
some of the anthropometry of Japanese players is going to be totally different than you see in Americans, just based off of cultural things, right? Like all of us Americans, we're going to drive everywhere, do whatever. Japanese, Europeans, even, right? Like they're going to walk to a lot of places, so they're
Hmm.
relatively more fit as just a general population. But obviously, you could probably assume that for baseball players too. But some of them that, you know, and you talk about just kind of more cultural things, talk about the Latin Americans. Obviously, they're a lot more vocal. They're getting after it. But they also like to go dancing. And I'll kind of go into a tangent story here. But in college, I had about four guys that were on my college team, uh, all middle infielders, as you could, believe. One of them played catcher, but they were like, "Hey, let's go to like the Hispanic club." I'm like, "What?" It's like, "Yeah, dude, your hips are really tight. Like you gotta come and loosen it up." I'm like, "Okay." Sure enough, like I'm over here trying to figure out how to dance, and my lower back is flaring up. I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I'm probably getting a little too much into the weight room, a little too stiff. I gotta learn how to move a little bit, you know?" Like I didn't think it completely related to baseball, but they were somehow like was like, "Hey, if you can learn how to do this, you'll be able to have better hip mobility." Little late for some of the adaptations in my life, but it was still, I was like, "Okay, yeah, I can see what you mean there. Now it's all in the hips," as you probably seen in some of those movies. But um, and even on the flip side of that, where you're talking about the, Japanese, Chinese, which I had some time in Taiwan, they're very, very rigid, right? So like you go from like super dancing loose to, very, very methodical, super hospitable people, by the way. But, like when we were getting ready to go warm them all up, they all put their gloves in a line, like an assembly line, just all straight up and perfectly laid flat. And you just throw it around or flap it anywhere, but they were all straight lined up. Me and Alec were both there actually.
Hmm.
But, they also do things like yoga, like people out here they play pickleball in America, but like you'll see people in the park literally just mats out or straight into the ground and doing yoga, and you're like, wow, this is different, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's funny too, because I looked at like Japanese Little League, and how much more strict that, I guess their mentality, their philosophies are there too. Because obviously here it's like Little League or in high school, you're only out for the field for a few hours of the day, but they're out there for 10 to 12 hours and just
Hmm.
kind of understand. And they're obviously very strict and everything's kind of laid out to kind of have an itinerary for everything.
Oh yeah.
Um, and you can kind of see it and also just in the way they moves. I think, especially pitchers from that part of the world, like they kind of like just even aesthetically or aesthetically looking at them, they kind of all have a similar delivery. Like
Mhm.
you Darvish or Otani kind of have like a pause or a hitch in their delivery, and then they kind of get into their linear move, and that's how they can kind of generate the amount of force and power that they do. And then obviously they rotate in similar ways as well. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how everything just from Little League on can kind of dictate um, its velocity itself and how you can perform even at the highest levels.
Absolutely. Well, and that's I also think of this too, you have your guys like uh King Griffey Jr. or Matt Holiday's kid, right? Any you could kind of go down the list. Bobby Bonds, Barry Bonds, right? Like they were around the game for so long at an early age that it almost seemed familiar to them, right? And they were visually seeing how all these really, really good players were moving versus like let's say you're in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, where I'm from. Right? Like I don't have a whole lot of people to look up to on like who moves well, who does this right or throws right or just being in that environment. I think that goes a huge ways too, and how those type of players that eventually do make it up, like they have a unmatchable edge because they are getting all this brain mapping coming in and they're seeing how all these people move, seeing as like, oh, hey, this is a possibility, or this is cool, or you can do this, or wow, this guy can jump and Ozzie Smith just did a flip, right? Like they're seeing all this as a young kid, and you're like, there's more to it than just, sitting on a couch and watching football games, being a armchair quarterback.
Yeah, definitely. I think environment's almost everything, especially when you're as a little kid surrounded by the best of the best too. It kind of makes sense that they ultimately become the best, even if they're not as invested into it as other people may be.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
Well, and I think that's where environment's really huge, especially when it comes to training. Like, yeah, remote training is awesome, and obviously a huge proponent of that myself. But where I've seen a lot of guys make huge jumps is when they're around a big environment. Maybe it's not even, a massive facility with all the fancy things. Like, it could just be you and three or four other dudes go into a field, competing your ass off, right? Getting into the thick of it. But having those people around you push you is a lot easier than playing long toss with yourself and throwing into a net, right? Like
Yeah,
you're just going to
absolutely.
develop totally differently than you would in that environment.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So with that, obviously that was a precursor to before you got into pro ball. Have you had a chance to kind of be around any of those types of players and kind of maybe oh, hey, yeah, this was probably pretty valid, or maybe, oh, hey, this guy might be an anomaly. Did that kind of track from what you observed and kind of looked at to maybe some players you saw play that maybe weren't in the White Sox organization that you were just like, oh, yeah, these guys kind of fit that mold, or maybe some of them that didn't?
Yeah, so the White Sox unfortunately don't have any pitchers from East Asia at the moment, but I was around surrounded by a ton of Latin American pitchers, and yeah, it absolutely does. I think in terms of both just looking at body composition, they're usually undersized compared to American pitchers. But yeah, if you look at their movement assessments in the weight room, or you look at their force and power output, or you look at them in our biomechanics lab and seeing looking at individual joints and velocities and all that stuff, you definitely see a good trend in that direction, seeing how because these players are from Latin America, they are moving in a different way, or they generate velocity and energy in a much different way compared to an American-born pitcher. So yeah, especially so for Latin America versus the U.S., definitely have seen it. In terms of East Asia, I think there's more research to be done, but based off what I've seen from other orgs or people I've talked to in other orgs, it definitely seems to be the correct trend too. But yeah, I think as time goes on too, and as we collect more data, I think it's gonna be great to see like how we can start to generate more and more conclusions, and hopefully that can influence development for years to come.
Love it. That's awesome. Well, outside of those three, right? So we said like North America, Northeast Asia, Latin America. What other maybe powerhouse do you kind of see coming around in the future? I know Driveline's branching out to like Brazil or some other ones have been going out and trying to make little pockets of things. Most of the pro orgs have their own, facility. I'm sure the White Sox have it. They have their own training and training camps out in the Dominican. So like they're really invested into that area because they get a lot of players, obviously for a little bit cheaper than they would here in the Americas. So there's an economical portion to that. But what other places do you think might see come around in the future?
Yeah, I guess I'm not entirely sure on specific countries. I think hopefully the next World Baseball Classic can kind of start to generate more and more interest for people across the world. I mean, I think countries that cricket's very popular in, I think that could definitely translate well to, I think it's stuff in other parts of Asia. And I think obviously Australia, and parts of Europe and Africa as well. I think if they kind of start to um, adopt baseball into their culture, I think they could be an incredible population to look at and see how they move differently too. And then you can also just look at that for other sports as well and see if there's any similarities to, let's say, obviously I know javelin's huge in Southern Asia, like countries like India and Pakistan, and kind of just seeing how they move there. And maybe you can see if India and those countries kind of start to adopt baseball, seeing how those similarities can relate, and hopefully we can get the next Shohei Ohtani or some other international superstar. But yeah, that'd be, I mean, just looking forward to it.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild. I mean, obviously, we had a really high draft pick from Australia this past year.
Mhm.
Um, and then also, you've seen the movies like Million Dollar Arm or whatever from the two kids from India. Uh, I also trained a couple guys from that kind of ethnic background, even though they were from the Americas. Like, that those do have some, merit and something to actually look at and think about when you are zooming out and looking at a little bit of a bigger picture, right? Um, One country, just kind of think of the World Baseball Classic, that I know they're always in the World Baseball Classic, but I've never seen them go very far. And I think I have a theory on this. And this just could be totally me being super biased, but Italy, right? I have my girlfriend is or fiance now is a Italian, huge Italian family, and when you go over to Italy, there's like 16-year-olds ripping cigarettes and drinking. And it's probably not too good for development, to be honest. And I'm sure there's guys who play professionally that don't even partake in any of that stuff. Maybe they just have heritage from there. But I'm like, kids from, being born and bred in Italy, it's going to be pretty hard for those guys to do that just based off of like, how they interact in day-to-day life. They're going to stop and everything and just go and eat and, have a good time, which is totally cool. It's totally fine. But they're definitely going to be behind as far as development is concerned, especially for like those Northeast Asia teams that are out there for 4 or 5 hours. The Dominicans that are there, they're like, hey, this is my chance to get off the island, right? Like there's a whole lot more skin in the game in those two, different types of groups, right? So, you know, it'll be definitely interesting to see. I know one in particular that they did really well was the Netherlands. So even though they are kind of from Europe, they're also pulling players from Curacao, they're also in kind of like the Caribbean. So they kind of
Mhm.
get a little bit of both. Um, so I'd be interested to see. I mean, yeah, they're still kind of Latin America to a degree, but they also kind of identify with Europe. So I'd be interested to see if there was someone who maybe like was born and raised in the Netherlands and they moved to Curacao or something else, or they moved to the States and then they ended up, being really, really good. That'd be kind of a really interesting path to look at.
Yeah, I mean, kind of adding on to that, I mean, I think future research should definitely look at that. I think it's great. But I mean, I know people that, let's say they were born in Japan and then they moved to the US when they were young, but they still kind of have adopted similar movement patterns to people from Japan. So I think it kind of ties into the idea of like early development and motor learning, which kind of starts the younger you are, the better, or the more you're going to kind of like generate that. I think muscle memory can sometimes not be the cause or existent, but I guess they kind of, your brain kind of understands more what happens to an earlier age, and they can kind of, the mind muscle connection, I guess it kind of infiltrates into the way you move and the way your body is obviously anatomically structured, and kind of go from there. So it's cool to see, like, even though like you're not really surrounded by Japanese culture for most of your life, you're still kind of moving similar to them because of stuff like your anatomy. And you can see stuff too for guys that were born, let's say, in the DR, or they're born in Cuba or Venezuela or Aruba, any Latin American country, and then they moved to the US at a young age, they're still kind of similar to the culture, the movement and playing styles um, down in the Caribbean. So I think it's very interesting to see like how the two can kind of work together. But yeah, so I think it's extremely fascinating.
Yeah, no, they definitely work together. And, a lot of times early in my playing career, I would hear a lot of coaches or maybe some scouts, they'd just kind of write up. I was like, oh, yeah, they got good genetics or they got good this. And, oh, yeah, he's a freak. Okay, help us identify that a little bit, right? Like, I
Hmm.
think we're getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty now where it's like, okay, hey, we can quantify some things a little bit more where we're not just having these crazy one-offs or, labeling people as something when there actually is a reason why, you
Yeah.
know. It's definitely we're honing in on it a little bit more, and I mean, there's probably going to be even more technology that continues to come out nowadays, but um outside of all that, like what else has been kind of piquing your interest, maybe either in the baseball world or outside of it, that's kind of also become a passion of yours?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things, I guess. In terms of baseball, a couple of the projects I was gonna work on when I was in graduate school before my stuff kind of came up with the White Sox, but one of the things, and I'm blanking on the name of the company too, it might be Victory. It's an insole company. So basically, you can
Heard of them.
slide this, yeah, you slide this like sole into your shoe, and it kind of measures your gait or your walking patterns, or kind of how you distribute force across your legs or across your feet as you walk. And I think it's interesting because I used to always look at guys that would kind of walk on their toes. Kind of looks like they're hopping when they're walking around. And then you see that a lot in baseball, but then a lot of common coaching or like for talking about working on a pitcher's delivery, it's like, oh, you got to get into your heel. You can't be quad dominant. But for guys like that, it's like, well, they don't have the ability at this point to do that. And let's say like you want to train them to do that, you want to hammer mobility and strength in their posterior chain for months on end. Let's say the best case scenario, they get to an average position into their heel. I'd rather attack what they're good at and get the most of what they're good at rather than kind of making them average all around. I think sometimes because everyone's kind of built differently, you can see just by looking at the way they walk, sees can dictate how they move on the mound too. So I think it's really cool to see the research that's coming out on that. Hopefully, if I can ever get the chance to conduct that research myself or see if anybody else can, I think that would be great. And then there's obviously stuff too that you look at off the field in terms of how you sleep and how you eat. And I think I'm a huge fan of wearables. I mean, I'm wearing both an Apple Watch and an Oura Ring right now, but just understanding how uh, sleep and heart rate and kind of everything in between and physical activity can dictate how ready you are to perform, or it can even be used for both prehab or rehab purposes, and kind of just seeing how things you do on again on a daily basis or an every other day or even a weekly or monthly basis can just dictate the how you feel all around. Just kind of going from there. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to diving into everything that I can get my hands on and just going from there. But yeah, there's a lot I can talk about for that.
Oh, I'm sure we could be on this for hours, man.
Yeah.
One thing, and it's for you, the listeners too, if you're kind of interested or want to go into more in depth, the Motor Preferences podcast, I'll put it in the show notes for reference, but it was almost 2 years ago now where they were kind of talking about like a aerial versus terrestrial, more on your toe versus your heel. I think they kind of oversimplify it where it's like, hey, you're either one or the other. And he even talks about on the podcast where like, hey, there's people that are kind of within a range. So they might favor a little bit more of one to the other. But you're totally spot on, man. Like, yeah, you can't have a round peg fit into a square hole. It's one of those things where we're learning a little bit more and we're finding out, hey, this is what we messed up, right? And now you're like, okay, what can I do to not mess this guy up? As you learn more and as you coach more, you're like, hey, I don't know very much, and I need to make sure that I'm not messing up anyone, putting them more at risk for injury, things like that, right? So it's It's just the constant tug of war that you have as you're growing and learning more and always asking questions, right? Like that's the biggest thing. I think if you feel like you have it figured out, then you've lost. You're
Yeah.
in the wrong part of the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think I went down one too many rabbit holes during my playing days. So yeah, hopefully others don't do the same thing that I did.
Hey, if it's what you're passionate about, you can go for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can definitely get in the Superdome with that. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I call it Yip City. I don't think you ever want to be part of that population.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's definitely going to tank your performance for sure if you end up
Hmm.
going down that way.
Yep.
Uh, Well, yeah, Steven, appreciate you coming on, my man. How can the listeners reach out to you? Where can they find you? If they just want to talk, chat, maybe get in touch with you a little bit in regards to either training or your perspective, especially now that you have some professional experience under your belt and kind of put that on the belt actually, right? Like you're just like, hey, got that notch down. But yeah, how can they reach out?
Yeah, so I've got a sports science page on Instagram. It's s.leicht, Leicht.ss. I think I'm definitely going to start adding a lot more or focusing a lot more on content and kind of just helping out as many people as possible. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me on there and really appreciate you having me.
Absolutely, you got it. And for those of you listening, stay in the zone.